Why you be all on my line about nothing? Why won't you go get you $1 or something? Dollar or something. $1 or something.
Recording live in the Conscious Creative Media Studios from somewhere in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina, you are listening to the world's greatest photography podcast with your host, Bill Howard.
Thank you, Scott, and this is the world's greatest photography podcast, and I am your host, Bill Howard. We can be heard on all the major platforms, including iTunes, Google Podcast, Spotify, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, not video, and any of your other favorites that you like listening to. And you can also catch us on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on YouTube at Conscious Creative Media, that's CRE8IVE. And today we're going to discuss real estate photography. And I have with me a gentleman from the Chesterfield, Virginia area, kind of in between Richmond and Petersburg. And he does photography, does videography. He runs Bertram Photography, which you can find on bertramphotography.com. Gerald Bertram. How you doing today, Gerald?
Doing good, Bill. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for coming with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Did I say anything wrong in all of that? Is that pretty much what you are and what you do?
Pretty much right on.
Perfect. I think you've listened to the podcast. I've seen your comments several times, and so you're not new to what we're about to do. This first segment, we always do these in 3 segments on YouTube. You'll catch them on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. On the podcast, you'll listen to the whole thing. We just have a couple of breaks in there. But this first segment we call Spray and Pray. And this is where I ask questions of my guest so that I can find something to talk about, because while this is the world's greatest photography podcast, I'm not necessarily the world's greatest podcast host. So, Gerald, are you ready to let's play?
Let's do it.
All right. So the first question, DSLR or mirrorless?
Well, let's see. I started DSLR, Canon, for a number of years. And just within the last year or so, moved over to mirrorless. So I'm shooting stills with Sony and video with Panasonic.
Okay. Well, that was going to be one of my other questions that comes up next. But, well, let's go ahead and go to that. Canon, sure. Nikon, or Sony. Why did you decide to switch over to Sony and even Panasonic?
Well, I was shooting Canon APS-C for a number of years, and so I was looking to go ahead and make the step up to full frame, mostly because Canon doesn't make a lot of great lenses for their smaller sensor cameras. So I wanted to get into more of the L glass, and that means full frame. So I started looking into it and looking at the costs involved, and then doing some more of the technical looks at it, and saw that, dollar to dollar, I'm actually going to get a little bit more going with Sony versus staying with Canon. And then that sort of opened my eyes to mirrorless. And the 2 big draws for me there was, of course, the EVF. And then secondly, the weight, because I've had back issues for a number of years. So the smaller I can get my gear, the better. And Sony kind of nails it in both those areas. Even their full frame cameras are really, really small and light. And of course, the EVF is, EVFs are great. So that's pretty much the reason that I switched over to Sony. For video, Panasonic just has it covered. I mean, the codec choices that you can get from even the GH4 is amazing. So we have a GH4, and then I also have a partner that I work with in Northern Virginia, and he'll shoot the videos up there, and then I take care of the editing, but he uses a GH5S there. And using the GH5S with one of the Metabone Speed Booster with the Canon 16-35 is just, we get nice, great, big, wide images, and just looks fantastic on that gear.
Well, I've never used a speed booster. Does it do anything as far as the integrity or the sharpness of the image?
Yeah, it can pull the sharpness down just a little bit, but the Metabones being sort of the king of speed boosters, that's going to be the one you would want to maintain the best quality. There are others made by Viltrox, Comlight's another one, and you not quite as good as quality. But when you're shooting video, anyways, at least in my industry, tech sharp is not necessarily the most important thing. So what the speed booster is giving us, it's a big advantage, is that increase, about a one-stop increase. So we can get, when we're shooting inside homes, typically it can be kind of dark. So if we could get another stop of light into the camera, that makes all the difference in the world. And then of course, with the, you get the wider frame where also on the GH5S with that sensor, with the speed booster, we are just under a full frame look on technically a micro four thirds camera.
Very nice. Now,
Yeah.
You've gone over to the Sony and as well as the Panasonic. As far as lenses, OEM, Tamron, or Sigma?
Well, when I made that switch, yeah, right. When I made that switch, another draw of the Sony system was it's extremely adaptable. So I had this investment in all this Canon L glass that I was starting to make, and I didn't need to replace it immediately with Sony because it adapts so easily. So I have a what is this little guy called, the Sigma MC11 adapter, and then I could throw my 16 to 35 or 70 to 200 L glass onto my Sony and don't miss a beat, because with photos, adapted lenses work fantastically on the Sony system. Video's a different story, but I don't shoot video on the Sony anyways. I use my Panasonic gear for that. And on my Panasonic gear, I'm pretty much using all native Micro Four Thirds lenses. But on the Sony, I didn't have to, immediately replace that. The L glass is beautiful glass anyway, so there was no real need to have to switch over to Sony. Will I one day? Probably, but right now there's really no big reason. The subjects in the type of photography that I shoot don't move. Houses pretty much stay where they are. So I have no problem shooting with adapted glass at all.
Now, do you stick mainly with prime or do you use zoom lenses?
Pretty much everything I shoot for real estate is on the Canon 16 to 35 L. I think it's version 2. For some more of the detailed shots, which unfortunately real estate, we don't really get a chance to do much of that, but when we can, then I might get some of my nicer Sony glass, the 50-1.8 or the 85-1.8. The Sony 85-1.8 is a beautiful lens, and it actually doesn't really cost an arm and a leg. I think I got mine used for somewhere in the $400 range. Beautiful lens, but I would probably say like 98% of real estate stuff's all done on the 16 to 35.
You are listening to the world's greatest photography podcast with your host, Bill Howard.
Well, you can follow Gerald at BertramPhotography.com is his website, or you can go to Instagram at Bertram_photo or Facebook at Bertram Photography. And you can also catch us at Conscious Creative Media on Facebook or on Twitter, any of the social platforms, as well as on YouTube at Conscious Creative Media. That's CRE8IVE. And that brings us, Gerald, which one? Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram?
Honestly, for my type of work, none. Social media doesn't really help in my line of work. I would probably say I get 90% of my business is word of mouth. Now, of course, when you're starting out, the challenge is getting yourself out there to get word of mouth to start with. But once you get to a certain level, social media doesn't do a whole heck of a lot for you. I mean, it's nice if you get to shoot a really beautiful house, it's great to post something on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. But as far as like getting business from it, social media doesn't really do a heck of a lot. Now, that's in my particular case. I don't know if guys that are shooting, $50 million homes, maybe would they show their stuff on, say, Instagram or Facebook, and then they get business from it. But for the type of stuff I'm shooting, social media is just for, my own personal enjoyment, or if I shoot something that I like in particular, I'll post it on there. But yeah, so of all of them, I guess Instagram would probably be the one where I could show more, since it's photography based.
And I shoot a lot of real estate, but I do commercial real estate, sports photography. Even on rare occasions, I'll do portraits if I have to.
So as do I.
And the way I use social media is, if somebody is asking or thinking about photography, I want my name to be the first one that pops in their head for whatever it is, because I'm not locked into one genre. And we'll discuss that a little bit later as well, but more into the technical aspect, back button or shutter release for focus.
Again, since my subjects aren't moving around, just shutter release is just fine. Now, if I'm going to go out and shoot like sports or something like that, or something with my kids and they're running all over the place, back button focus makes a whole lot more sense. But for me, with my real estate work, shutter release is really all I need.
Now, do you use a timer or a remote release when you're shooting?
Yeah, I have a remote control for the Sony, and then the camera's also set to a 2-second delay. So I get everything framed up the way I want it, hit the shutter on the remote, then it's still another 2 seconds. That way I make 100% sure that my camera's not going to wiggle or anything's going to cause any kind of vibration, because when I shoot, I tend to use what folks are calling the flambient technique. So I could be firing off at one time. Well, interiors, 2 or 3 different exposures. And if I'm shooting exteriors, depending on the dynamic range of the scene, I could shoot as many as 8 frames if I need it.
That brings us to our next question, since you mentioned flambient. For flambient, for those that don't know, that's combining flash with non-flash shots. And so you use it's almost like a HDR technique, just adding an extra frame with a more exposed photo. So do you use 3 brackets, 5 brackets, 7 brackets?
Sure. I'm sure the way I'm doing it's probably a little bit different than the traditional flambient, but so for exteriors, that's pretty basic. That like I said, that could be anywhere from a 3 to 7 exposure shot there, so that I can get a really nice sky with the house. Interiors,
I guess a lot would depend on shadows from trees and things like that as well.
Yeah, and the Sony cameras have the Sony full frame cameras have a pretty amazing dynamic range already. So sometimes it's not even really necessary. But if it's like if you got to the house in a bad time of day and the sun's on the other side of the house and you're trying to get the sky and the back of the house that's in shadow, you might need a few more exposures so you can get a nice even transition from the house to the sky. But for interiors, most of the time I'll get a ambient shot, a perfectly exposed ambient shot. More than likely 1 or however many I end up needing window pull shots, so that I make sure I have a really nicely exposed view outside the window. Then I'll get the flash out, and depending on the size of the room, a single flash might get it, but I might need to move around the room and get anywhere from 2, 3, 4 more different flash shots from different corners. Then I'll take all that into Photoshop, and I'm doing compositing with all the flash shots. Then take my ambient shot on top of that, blend that in where I want the nice ambient light or shadows, and then of course drop in the window pulls. And I do that. I know a lot of people, and I think you mentioned before that you also don't shoot flash, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just been my experience. I've had a really difficult time getting really, really accurate colors without shooting flash. And for some of the clients that my partner and I work with in Northern Virginia, these, especially when you start to get to like the $1 million plus homes, they have put so much money into the interiors of these houses and made very particular choices for the color of their walls and stuff. We have to absolutely nail that color accuracy. Otherwise, we're going to go back and have to reshoot it, or, maybe not get the gig again, from that agent again. So color accuracy is hugely important. And also, some of the rooms in these houses are enormous. I mean, just gargantuan, 3-story high foyers sometimes. And ambient light just won't cut it with that. So we have to get out, both my partner and I use the Godox system. So, sometimes we can get away with just the smaller 8200 flashes, or sometimes we have to step it up to the 360 or the 400 watt second flashes. So that's kind of how we work.
Yesterday or last night, in one of the real estate photography groups, there was somebody that posted 2 photos and asked which one that we liked better. And the majority liked the second photo better. It was nice, bright, clean, white kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was the ceiling was the same color in both photos, and the first photo was more of a bone white. So my response was, what color is the actual cabinets? Is it bone white or is it bright white?
Exactly.
I mean, it's easy enough to desaturate and make it what color you want, but that doesn't necessarily depict what is there.
Right.
And, in real estate photography, we have to depict what is there.
Yep.
So do you use auto white balance, or do you have presets, or shoot 5200K, or?
Well, pretty much we're set on auto white balance most of the time. If we're firing off a flash, I've never had a point where I've hit a flash shot and the camera couldn't pretty much nail, the white balance. And of course I shoot everything raw. So no matter what, I'm taking everything into Lightroom and, hitting the dropper and making sure I've got a really accurate white balance in there. And that's, I think where you mentioned we're going to talk about this. So the software and stuff that I use is primarily Lightroom and Photoshop. So everything comes into Lightroom. I do all of my sort of basic edits, flash, shadows, highlights, all that kind of stuff, setting the white balance. And then I pull all of those shots into Photoshop to do all of my, flambient compositing work inside there.
Well, be sure to catch us on the podcast sites as well as on YouTube at Conscious Creative Media. That's CRE8IVE. And our guest today, Gerald Bertram. You can catch him at BertramPhotography.com, or on Instagram at Bertram_photo, or on Facebook at Bertram Photography. And you just mentioned Lightroom and Photoshop. So I was going to ask Adobe or DaVinci, but that kind of settles that. So what about this, Windows or Mac?
I'm Windows, totally Windows. And it's interesting because, let me kind of explain my relationship with my partner in Northern Virginia. So of course I shoot everything around the Richmond, Chesterfield area, and he shoots everything, the stuff all through DC, Northern Virginia, Alexandria, even into Maryland sometimes. And then he sends me all of those raw images or video to me, and I do all the editing on that. And so he's on a Mac. But thankfully, there seems to be no issue moving images between Lightroom on a Mac and Lightroom on Windows. Luckily, there's no weird file format issues or anything like that. So we're able to work together really well. And on the video side, I use Adobe Premiere. But there's no, I don't have to worry about what he uses because I do 100% of the editing with the video work. So yeah, definitely all Adobe and Windows, but there's no particular reason why. You can get better hardware for cheaper going with Windows. But there's certainly something to be said with the reliability that you get with Mac hardware. And again, for as far as Adobe goes, just because that's what I'm used to using, I've used it my whole life. I'm thinking about making the move over to DaVinci for video editing because Adobe Premiere is it crashes like crazy. It's just not a great piece of software, but for some reason, it's the sort of the gold standard. But I'll probably be spending the next few months trying to get more familiar with DaVinci, and I may make the switch over to that. But until a piece of software comes out on the photo side that can increase my workflow, which is basically reducing the time I have to spend editing photos, I'll be sticking with Lightroom and Photoshop. Right now, that's just it's what I'm used to using. It's how I can get stuff done the quickest.
Now, do you use any plugins such as Infuse or anything like that, or do you use? Okay.
Yeah, for the exterior
and
stuff.
You want to explain that process a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So like I mentioned with the exterior stuff, you might shoot anywhere from 3 to 7 or even more different exposures for the exterior depending on the light difference between the sky and the ground. So I will bring those, and say for example, I shoot a 5 bracket shot. I'll pull all those into Lightroom and look to see which image has the best highlights, which image has the best midtones, and which one has the best exposed shadows. Stack those 3 images together in Lightroom, then use the Infuse plugin and just kind of tell it do its thing on this stack. And by magic, I don't know the algorithm it uses, but it seems to just nail a nice even exposure for all those different images to get me a shot that just looks great. I've tried using the blending that's in Lightroom and the one that's in Photoshop, and what I end up getting is a very, like you mentioned before, very HDR looking image. It's not, for me, it's just not pleasing enough. Whereas in using the Infuse software, when it blends my exposure stacks, they just look great to me. And then most importantly, they look great to the clients, and that's really all that matters.
Well, we're here today with Gerald Bertram, and we're finishing up segment 1, which is Spray and Pray. And if you're listening on the podcast, stay tuned. We're going to return right after this short break. If you're watching on YouTube, catch segment 2 on Wednesday, not Tuesday, and catch segment 3 on Friday. We are the world's greatest photography podcast, and we are with guest Gerald Bertram.
Something dollar, something get you a dollar, something. Why you be all on my line about nothing? Why won't you go get you a dollar, something dollar, something. Get you a dollar, something. Stop it.